Hello everybody, welcome to episode 141 of Show Viewers. Today we'll be going over Uzumaki by Junji Ito. Now, right here I have the Viz Deluxe Edition. It has all 3 volumes in the extra 20th bonus chapter. Got that right there. And then got the art on the front. Now, this is a horror manga. It's actually the first horror manga that I've ever gotten into. And I know Junji Ito is renowned for his horror manga, and I started wanting to look into it because I was like, yo, I've heard about Uzumaki. I'm like, I'm going to check this out, see if it's any good. And it is. It lives up to the hype. So, Uzumaki, what it follows is the spiral into horror. Now, what we're exposed to now, there's a lot of Japanese names in this book and this manga, and I'm probably going to obliterate some of them. So just bear with me, because I didn't watch the anime. Like I said, I just read the manga, so I only have what I believe is the correct pronunciation of them. But yeah, so in the first chapter, we were introduced to the town of Kuruzucho. I think that's how you say it. And this town, small little quaint town. I believe it's said to have a population of 6,000 people, so nothing crazy, but still a pretty sizable town. And we see as this town is haunted by a spiral. Now, the spiral essentially is some like eldritch haunting thing. I'll just have to explain as the story goes. So I have to kind of explain the story first. So we see as the story begins, and we're introduced to Kitty. I'm just gonna say Kitty because it's Kirie. Kitty Goshima. Yeah. And she is a young high school girl who is kind of going about her life. She has a family friend and eventually her boyfriend by the name of Suichi Saito. And we see as Suichi's father has become obsessed with spirals. He's collecting a bunch of things with a bunch of spiral designs in them, and he's going crazy. He's going very fascinated with spirals, and like he's making his bath spiral and all that. He ends up going to Goshima's dad, who's a kiln worker or like a pottery, not a pottery man. Crap. I don't remember exactly the name for a potter. Oh, yeah, a potter. I'm stupid. But yeah, he's a potter, and he's like, yo, I need you to make me some spiral pottery. And like, he's like, all right, yeah, I will. So we see as this actually gets to the point where ultimately it's getting insane. So Shuichi's mother ends up throwing out all of his stuff, and his dad goes crazy. He starts beating his mom and all of that. And well, Shuichi's dad starts beating his mom, and obviously this is a surprise to Shuichi and Kitty. And so we see as ultimately this continues to play out until one day, Kitty ends up going to his house, and she's like, "Yo, I have the pottery," and he's like, "I don't need that anymore. I figured out how to find spirals with myself," and he starts like rotating his eyes and stuff like that. And yeah, so later we ultimately learned that no one has heard from Shuichi's dad, for like a couple of days, and then ultimately they go and find him that he has turned himself into a spiral in like a barrel, and it is whack looking. Let me see if I can find it here just to show you. Yeah, that right there has happened to him. And so we then see as after this, in the second chapter, his mom, Shuichi's mom, starts to like devolve into the madness. She starts freaking out anytime she sees a spiral. She sees the form of Shuichi's dead dad, and he's like speaking to her and all that. Like, so it's very odd. And this ultimately leads to her being hospitalized, and she starts harming herself. She cuts off her fingertips because they have spirals in them, and she just removes every type of spiral in her body. She goes bald. She can't see spirals. And then this ultimately gets to the point, at one point, she's under a consultation for possibly going to a mental hospital, and there is a spiral on the wall with the cochlea in the ear. And Shuichi freaks out about this. He ends up covering it all up. But then we see as ultimately the hauntings get to Shuichi's mother, and she envisions his father in that weird spiral form one more time. And he's like, "You have spirals in your ears." And she ends up going and checking in front of everyone. She's like, "Yo, do I have spirals in my ears?" And ultimately, no one tells her that she does, but she ends up stabbing out her ears anyways. And then obviously going insane, and this messes up with her equilibrium and her hearing until ultimately she dies. And yeah, so then we go into the third chapter where we introduce this character. I believe her name's Azami, because this book is very like monster of the week essentially, because Azami, because it goes about like each chapter kind of has a new monster besides like a couple smaller arcs here and there. But yeah, Azami ends up pulling up, and she is a girl who is able to like attract any men that she wants, because apparently she has like this hypnotic ability from a scar on her forehead that she got as a child. And we see at one point that she ends up, Shuichi's kind of become a recluse after all this stuff has happened, because obviously he's very traumatized, but he also wants to stay away from the spiral because he knows the effects of the spiral. And we see as he ends up coming in contact with Azami because Kitty ended up telling him about all this stuff, telling her about all this stuff, and she was like, you know what, I want to meet him. So she ends up going to meet him, and Shuichi is not attracted to Kitty at all. Like she does not have her way with him, and we see as this like sits her on a crazy rampage. Like she goes about. And she is doing everything she can to get in contact with Shuichi because she's like, I gotta figure out what's going on here. And she's like falling in love with him because he is not drawn to her. But yeah, so after that, we end up seeing as she ends up planning to draw someone out by getting another person who is supposedly in love with her to go and lure Shuichi out because he wants to talk about Kitty, and this ultimately draws Shuichi out when we see as this dude ends up dying to the swirl because Azami has developed a swirl in her face, like her eye starts to cave in and all that, and she absorbs this dude into her swirl. And then we see as the swirl, in fact, absorbs her, and then both of them end up dead. But yeah, so I try and get this as chronologically as possible because, like I said, it is very gosh, what would I say, a monster of the week. But yeah, after the Azami stuff, we see as we get some more spiral shenanigans. We see as Kitty's father has started to make spiral-based pottery because what has happened is each time when both, I forgot to mention this, but when both Shuichi's parents died, they were cremated, and when they were cremated, the ashes flew up into the sky, made a spiral, and went into this pond known as Dragonfly Pond. And from this, we have seen some odd stuff originating. We actually see here that Kitty's dad has been sourcing his clay for his pottery from the Dragonfly Pond, and this has led his pottery to have odd spiral designs and all that. And this ends up leading him down a crazy rabbit hole, and honestly, it just kind of plays out until ultimately no one really ends up dying because of this one. This is kind of the lesser ones. We see as they start to see faces in his works and all of that. And at one point, they're going to eat on the pottery and everything until, I believe it's one day, where they start to hear like screaming and like the wails of Shuichi's parents from the kiln, and they ultimately end up destroying it. But yeah, so then, okay, yeah, this is actually one of the ones I really like. Okay, Twisted Soul, Chapter 5. We see as two heart-struck lovers who are from similar economic circumstances are not allowed to be with each other because they're feuding families. And we see as they, like, try and do whatever they can to run away until ultimately one day they are able to successfully get away, but not for long. And during this time, we see as they notice two snakes mating, and they're all twisted up and all of that. And ultimately, they end up getting found by their parents again. And Shuichi and Kitty are helping these two lovers to escape from their parents because their parents are not going to allow them to be because they live in the same like tenement and they just hate each other because they have a family rivalry even though they are both very similar. And so we see this plays out until ultimately they run away for the last time. They run away until they ultimately end up getting to the beach where here they are hit by the curse of the spiral and they both contort and twirl and turn into like this sea serpent thing and go into the ocean never to be seen again. Yeah, so let's look. Which curse is next? Medusa. Okay, Medusa is a arc where we see as Kitty is actually affected by the curse. And, well, actually, the curse of the spiral. I gotta figure out her friend's name. I'm just gonna say her friend because, honestly, this character is not very important. But yeah, so we see Kitty is affected by this, and ultimately her hair ends up going crazy and curled and all that, and starts drawing people's attention. They become mesmerized. And then one of her friends is like, you know what, I want to be popular too. Even though Kitty never wanted to be popular. And she tries to remove her hair ties, but it ends up strangling her and disabling her from doing so. And this ultimately, then her friends start growing her hair, and they have like a hair battle eventually, where Kitty is ultimately freed by Shuichi by him cutting her hair after she gets hair mogged by her friend, and then her friend's hair ends up tying her to a telephone pole where it curls up and ultimately drains all of her energy from her. Because we see as Kitty actually became more lethargic the longer her hair grew, and all this ends up leading ultimately to her getting turned into a husk on a telephone pole. Well, not Kitty, but the other person. But yeah, then we have Jack in the Box. Jack in the Box wasn't a very important part of the manga. We see as actually this kid by the name of, I can't even remember what his name is. It's like Kuru something. Let's see. Mitsuru. Yeah, Mitsuru. And Mitsuru ends up falling in love with Kitty, and we see as it grows very obsessive, he starts following her everywhere, looking for her attention. And we see as this plays out until ultimately one day he's like, you know what, I'm going to stop this car with my love. So he ends up jumping in front of a car and he gets ripped into like the front tire hub area of the car and like all contorted. It was a very nasty scene. I'm not going to show it to you. But yeah, We see this, and then ultimately ends up being buried. And one day we see as there is a package that she's given. Well, she actually got this package from Mitsuru before he died, and this ends up leading her and Shuichi to his grave, where they ultimately end up digging up the grave. And from this grave, his corpse ends up popping out, all like mangled and everything, and it starts following them, trying to attack him. Until one point, it turns into a Jack in the Box. Essentially, it has a spring, but it's the suspension spring from the car, and ultimately he just ends up falling away. But now the next chapter is entitled, let's see here, The Snail. Now the snail is a very important chapter because it comes to play later on. So we see as Kitty is going to school where one of her classmates is in fact starting to exhibit very odd symptoms. And we see that throughout this, this classmate slowly starts to get more and more of a hunchback until one day he straight up turns into a snail. And then he had a bully throughout all this who was like bullying him for being weird, essentially. And then we see after this, the bully gets turned into a snail by the spiral, because obviously what is an animal with a spiral shape on it? A snail. And so we see then as they're putting an enclosure at the school, because I guess everyone's okay with these two kids having turned to a snail. I guess their parents are A-okay with it. But yeah, we see then as one day they escape and they end up going out and they mate and produce eggs. And we see as a teacher of the class ends up going and destroying these eggs, and because he doesn't want any more of this human snails going about, he wants to find the other ones so they can't produce any more. And so next day, or like one of the next days afterwards, teacher pulls up as a snail, so people are turning to snails left and right. Now the next one is just kind of about like a lighthouse arc where people were getting toasted alive in a lighthouse that was affected by the spiral. It's not really important, so I'm not going to go over it. But yeah, so the next one, this is my favorite arc. Mosquitoes and the umbilical cord. So mosquitoes is, we see as these mosquitoes are coming about and they're starting to fly in like hypnotic circles. And in these circles, they're luring people to sleep, and the mosquitoes are essentially just devouring them. We see as pregnant women are specifically being targeted by the mosquitoes. So like, we see as actually Kitty's cousin, Kaeko, or Keiko, Keiko, her right here, you can't really see her, but she's the one with the black hair in the corner there. But yeah, she is affected, and she ends up coming into the hospital. Now we see that a bunch of pregnant women have been affected by mosquitoes, so they're kind of going crazy and all of that. And we see as ultimately, Kitty is still staying in the hospital because of the effects of the previous chapter with the lighthouse and all of that. And we see as people start to mysteriously die around the hospital. Like, people are dying, they appear to be drained of blood and all of that. And obviously people are worrying about the mosquitoes until one night we see as Kitty wakes up because she hears an odd droning, and the pregnant mothers are going around and draining people's blood like mosquitoes. This arc was actually kind of creepy. Like, honestly, this is the scariest arc, in my opinion, out of all of Uzumaki. We see as they're going around gorging on people's blood, consuming others, and we actually even see as Keiko is trying to attack, Kitty, because Kitty is within the hospital. And ultimately, we see as other people hypnotically lured in by the mothers and all of that, and Keiko ends up trying to kill Kitty, but during this, we see that previously, while Kayako and Kitty were being visited by Shuichi, he'd used bug spray on one of the bugs in the area, and it had some effect on Kayako. But ultimately, we see as this bug spray is left on the floor, so Kitty ends up using it to ward off the mothers, and they are scared away, essentially. But yeah, so after that, we end up seeing as the mothers continue to ultimately give birth, and everything seems good and dandy. However, people start getting these odd mushrooms in their food. And during this time, the mothers are still feeding and harvesting on it, obviously. And we see, honestly, as the babies start to get weird, distended stomachs. Like, it's very odd. Now, after this, we see as Kitty starts to go about and, tell the people about this. But the people are kind of obsessed with these mushrooms, and they're not really focused on anything else. Until eventually, Kitty ends up going and hearing certain things, and ends up finding the room where all these mushrooms are coming from. The babies are, in fact, producing mushrooms from their stomachs. And it is very odd, very peculiar. It's honestly kind of disturbing. This is one of the body horror parts that is actually kind of disturbing. But yeah, so we see this, and then we see as the doctor who operated on these mothers is trying to return infants back to the stomach of the mothers, because the infants have been, speaking telepathically, and they yearn to be here. But yeah, so he ends up inserting this one back into Kayako, and it's not, I don't like it. She's out nude in this panel, so I can't show it to you, but it is disturbing. And she ends up ultimately killing the doctor, and we see as everyone there is essentially massacred, but Kitty is able to escape the hospital, and everything ends up being kind of kaput. But yeah, so the next one is kind of where the final arc of the story begins. It's called The Storm. Now, ultimately, a spiral hurricane typhoon ends up coming through the town of Kurozocho, Zucho, however you say it, and it starts to destroy a bunch of stuff, and ultimately ends up targeting Kitty because of her attachment to this spiral. But ultimately, she is saved by Shuichi and all of that, and it just progresses along until I don't believe there's an arc between this. So yeah, let's get to the end of the storm. And the house. Yeah, in the house, after this, we see as the Goshima family has to move to a separate house during this because their house was destroyed in the hurricane. And during this time, they learn of their neighbors having an odd illness where this old woman's son ultimately ends up dying because of this odd fungal skin infection. And the Goshima family begins to get infected with it. But ultimately, they are able to, and so does this other person that's living near him. But ultimately, he ends up getting it, and they end up being able to kill him once he gets fully taken over by the disease, and then it releases all of them from their grasp. But after this, we see as due to more people's houses being destroyed and all of that by, yes. Due to more people's houses having been destroyed by the hurricanes and all that, they start to move into these little houses that are called, I can't even, what exactly was the name? They're like old rundown shack areas that are within the town. There's multiple of them, and they're called row houses. Yeah, row houses. And they are all run down. They look from a very distant age. I believe they're mentioned to be from the 19th century, so 1800s. And ultimately, people start moving into these like crazy. But during this time, we see as a news reporter by the name of, I'm just going to say Chi, because it's Chie. I'm going to say Chi. She ends up getting stranded in the town, and she ends up coming down to the town while it's there because her car that she was in had a crash, and the two people that were with her ended up dying in the crash, and she ended up heading to town looking for help. And we see as then she comes upon this and all the people hoarding in the house, and she sees that kids are able to like summon typhoons out of nowhere, like little whirlwinds. And this is due to the fact that the spiral has affected them to the point where they can summon like whirlwinds due to the pressure in the Dragonfly Pond, because all of the hurricanes and stuff that came through were focused on Dragonfly Pond. The eye was there, and so it built up a bunch of pressure, and now typhoons are getting spawned everywhere, or little whirlwinds, tornadoes, whatever you're gonna call them. Yeah, so they start to get spawned everywhere, even by like the slight move of a hand or speaking too loud and all that stuff. And so we see as these people are starting to hoard in these areas where ultimately everything obviously starts breaking into chaos. When you get too many people in one area, we see as gangs start to form up where they're forming tornadoes and traveling around. And we see all this play out until ultimately the people start crowding way too much into the areas that are the row houses. And this obviously leads to immense overpopulation. We see as people have actually started to turn into snails as well, just like the previous one. And now there are outlaws that are eating these human snails. And everything's just kind of going crazy. Everything's falling into chaos. Chapter 15 is in fact entitled Chaos. And we see as it all plays out until ultimately the people in the row houses are shown to have started to combine together. They have started to fuse and turn into these odd amalgamates. And obviously Kitty, Shuichi, and Mitsuo, who is her younger brother, and Chi are all traveling around in a group. They end up meeting with these other person called Mr. Tanakami or something like that. Crap. What's his full name? I'm horrible with these names. I gotta find his name again. Tanamaki, no. Gosh. So what's it up there? Tanazaki, that's his name. But yeah, so we see Tanazaki is joining them, and he ultimately gets the idea to develop upon these row houses. And we see as it ultimately plays out, Tanazaki and group end up separating away from Chi, Shuichi, Kitty, and Mitsuo. And we see then, as people within the other group end up turning into snails, they start freaking out and all of that, and they try and end up finding a way to block this spread of infection. And we also see as the Japanese military starts to pull up, and it appears that they're going to be safe, but they ultimately end up getting absorbed into a whirlpool in the ocean. It's all kind of scatterbrained, but like that's kind of how everything is going on. But yeah, we see then as people of Tanazaki's group start munching on snail because they have nothing else to eat, and we actually see as Shuichi ends up having to fall to do so, and so does Chi and Kitty. because they have nothing else to eat, and they go and take it to go and plan to take it to Katie's mother, who is been badly injured by falling debris and all of that, but they actually get back and the debris has covered them, and we see as Mitsuo has been buried in debris as well, but he's ultimately saved, and those see that he's starting to develop a snail spiral on the back, because we've learned that the snail spiral forms when you don't move around quick enough. When you're slow and you remain in one area for a long time, you end up developing this snail spiral pattern. But yeah, so we see this, and since they know that he will likely be eaten, or Mitsuo will likely be eaten if they don't escape this or find a way to escape the spiral, they end up searching for a way on trails. And ultimately, some of Tanazaki's crew ends up running into him while they're on these trails, and they end up joining him for a brief time, but then they end up eating one of their own people because he turns into a snail, and this is where, Shuichi, Kiri, and Chi and Mitsuo end up separating. And during this time, we see as the group actually ends up coming back to them, they're like, yo, why'd you leave us? And they're like, oh, we just had to get along, we were just got separated. And then they start to ask questions about Mitsuo, because like, they see he's got an ollie home back, and they're like, oh, it's just a backpack. And so we see ultimately as they end up seeing as Mitsuo actually turns into a snail, where they end up running away from the group, and they tell Mitsuo to run off and go down the cliff, but he obviously does this after some being promoted to do so, or prompted. And then the other group comes on like, yo, where's the snail? And they're like, oh, we don't know where the snail is, there's no snail here. And ultimately they end up going away. I believe that, yeah, they just go away, because I don't think they get killed or anything. No, I don't believe they do. No, they actually start turning into like these spiral beast things, because they get so obsessed with the infection by the spiral. But yeah, so we see it as after all of this travel, the group actually just ends up having gone in a circle, and they head back into town, where they see as the town has been turned into this massive like spiral labyrinth. As we see here, this beautiful 2-page spread, and they get down there and they're like, yo, we're going to travel through the labyrinth. So they start going through the labyrinth, looking for a way to end all of this. And they end up running into Tanizaki, who's been building all of this, and he says that years have passed, and how time works is that within the spiral, time is perpetually stopped while it progresses on the outside, and since they were outside of the effects of the spiral, time passed infinitely, but also not at the same time. It's kind of an odd concept. But yeah, they end up going through this, and Tanazaki's like, yo, there's some pitfalls up ahead, so watch out. And we see as people who've been affected by the spiral, or like the amalgamate people, are dying and falling and being kicked out of the buildings and all that. But ultimately, everything begins to continue until eventually we hear as, like I said, more of them die. They actually ask the group to end up taking them out, but they're like, no, I'm not doing this. And we see as Kitty, Chi and Shuichi end up heading along, and they ultimately get separated from Chi, who ends up getting left behind, and then all of the like amalgamates are wiped out. And then we eventually see as Kitty and Shuichi end up reaching this area that like allows them to go down further into the spiral. They reach Dragonfly Pond, which was at the center of the spiral. And so they start going down it and all of that until ultimately they end up like at this area where they actually get attacked by one of the amalgamate creature things, and Shuichi ends up falling down this big spiral path. But Kitty's able to progress all the way down until she slips off at this final like plinth area. Let me find it real quick. Plinth. Yeah, this like big monolith thing. Oh crap, you can't see it. 1 second. That right there. She ends up falling down that until they land, and they see that a massive spiral city has been formed beneath. And we get this beautiful Kentaro Miura looking panel here of the city of spirals, which has been beneath Kurozuchi like the entire time. And we see as all this plays out, and she ultimately ends up finding her parents at the bottom of the spiral, embraced with each other, and then everything ends because like they let Shuichi and Kitty. Shuichi can't move because he fell down here, and they realize that there's nothing that they can really do, and they cannot defeat the spiral because what it has been doing is it has been completely eradicating the town, then allowing it to repopulate possibly centuries later, and then wiping them out once more. It's a perpetual cycle of obliteration that the spiral has been doing, and they're only 2 people. They can't defeat it. And so we see as they end up entwining together, and that is where Spiral ends up retracting, and the story ends because they were unable to beat the perpetual existence of the Spiral. Now, that's where the main story is. Then we get like this story about that's entitled "The Galaxies." It's a bonus chapter, and we see as a bunch of people start noticing new galaxies, and this allows them to then communicate telepathically through radio waves, and they end up freaking out and all of that. And this one dude wants to be the sole owner of this one galaxy that Shuichi discovered, and we see as this all plays out until ultimately he ends up doing something. I can't remember exactly what happens to him. He ends up seeing the galaxy, and then he turns into a galaxy himself, flies into the sky, and then that's that. So yeah, that was kind of the crazy and odd story of Uzumaki. Now, body horror doesn't really do it for me. This story is body horror predominantly, and it just doesn't really scare me. It doesn't really get iffy with me. Like I said, there were some things with like the mosquitoes and the umbilical cord chapters, which were kind of freaky, but it's just kind of, it's not really my thing. I prefer a psychological horror. But that's not to say this wasn't good. I really enjoyed this, and I will be checking out more Gungi Ito because like I really enjoyed this, and especially the ending part. Like the last like 8 chapters of this, phenomenal because they're like more cohesive story. Like, I prefer when a story is story rather than just a kind of monster of the week. I just prefer straight story, but it was still very good. Like, did not get me wrong, and I really enjoyed this. And like I said, I will be checking out more Gungi Ito. I believe I'm gonna check out The Deserter next, which is like a 12-volume collection or something like that, or like 12 different story collection. But yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. Just kind of, if they haven't made a foray into horror manga, if they want to make a foray into Gungi Ito, because it's a really good place to start off. Like I said, it's kind of confusing at points because there's just so much crap going on. But like, it's not really, because I mean, there is a lot of stuff going on, but it's like nothing crazy. Like there's detail, there's depth to it, but like it's nothing that you can't comprehend. Like it's not some, I don't know, some philosophical level stuff. It's genuinely just a good story that has some complexity to it, especially for only 20 chapters. So yeah, I would highly recommend this, and obviously I didn't do the complete like coup de grace of breaking it down, but like still, I believe I did a decent job, but there is still a lot that you can take from this, even if you've listened to my review, because there's a lot more in here that I skipped over or missed or whatever. So yeah, highly recommend reading this. That's all I really have for the Uzumaki manga. That's all I really have for episode 141 of Shelf Review. So thank you very much for watching.